And then the last picks, right? Obviously, this the last third of the draft, picks 9 through 12. And when we look at the ninth pick, this is where I think the biggest, unless your draft goes and you like somebody here in the top 10, like you mentioned, the top 14, I think this is really where the question marks start coming in, right? Like an AJ Brown, does he have the ceiling? A Puka Nacua, can he do it again? Saquon Barkley, he has the upside for number one, but he's been hurt. What do you do here at this 109? Because I feel like it's just like the middle round picks, but now we're starting to get in a little bit more hard decisions about your first round player.
Yeah, so I like me personally, okay, if I had to have a pick, the worst pick for me is the 109. And the reason why is just because how you start the draft. Like it's all about how you start the draft. So I still really like the player that you get in the first, but maybe other people don't because there is questions about Garrett Wilson, other players, AJ Brown, Puka Nacua. So you may not get a player that you really like in the first round. And then the biggest problem is just in the second round too, is you got to pick this guy like do you love Marv? And you kind of feel like, do I got to take Marv here? Or can I just go Mike Evans and Mike Evans? But sometimes Mike Evans goes a full round after Marv, so it's
Yeah.
like you're kind of just stuck in this no man's land a little bit where you got to just take the player that you really want. Don't care about the ADP, but the player that you want could also go a full round later than where you really want to take them. So it's just I don't like the 109, and then but the 1010 is kind of very, very similar, but you're just in a better spot to land. Like once again, I think there's a top 14 guys. Sometimes Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley fall there to you at the in the second round, which I think is great. I love that start because then you can build out your team the rest of the way. And then 11 and 12, I love those two spots just because once again, how you started. Like even though you don't love Puka Nacua, you could just skip out on him and he could fall to you at like the 202, which I think is a really good spot for him to be there. Like I'm okay with taking him there. Where you can go with like AJ Brown, Jonathan Taylor. You could go with like sometimes even Jahmyr Gibbs, Gary Wilson. I've seen go back end of the first round. You could double dip on both those guys. So I think it's just I love the beginning rounds, the beginning picks because you're just able to get your guy in the first round and it's really good targets on the rest of the way out. End of the second or end of the first round is just you're able to start, in my opinion, with two absolute studs. And maybe they may
Yeah.
not be the number one player in fantasy football, but just that core two players, they could be top five guys at their respective positions. I think is fantastic. So it's just that 8, 9, or 9, 10 is where you just miss out on those guys.
I would say that, yeah, you're kind of forced to take the best of the worst of the best at the top in the 9 and 10 spot. And then in the second round, you're forced to take, you have to reach on the player that you want, and it's like you have to make the first decision of who do you think is the best player out of Garrett Wilson, Marvin Harrison, Drake London, Puka Nacua, Brandon. You have to make that decision now before everybody else does. So the 9 and 10 spot, I think it can be good if somebody slips to you, say a Breece Hall slips to you, or Jamar Chase slips to you, or Bijan slips to you. Like I feel like you can get potentially a high upside guy that could be the wide receiver one or the running back one at this spot. But then you also need a hit on that second round pick.
Yeah.
And I really have concerns about the 11 and 12 spot. It can work out, right? But the part I get concerned about is this is very tempting to take running back in this area. Where you take Saquon and Taylor, Gibbs and Kyron. Like what there's a lot of times that's the tempt. And then we've talked about it here as far as getting receiver early. There's also a very big dip after I would say the top 20 to 21 receivers. It starts to become like a clear tier break there. And that's about where the tier break starts. So you might be having to rely on, I don't mind it typically, but like you might have to rely on a George Pickens or a Devontae Smith or a Jalen Waddle to be like your number one receiver at that spot. And say you decide, man, I also see a lot of value here. I want to get a tight end. I want to get a Travis Kelce who's now slipped into the fourth round. You have to be very careful with that because then you come back to the fifth and sixth round and it's like those receivers now could be that range we talked about of Jaden Reed and, Calvin Ridley and a lot of the question marks that come in that range. So I think that's it's a tempting thing to do to take two running backs there at the 11 and 12 spot. I've seen it happen a lot. It's just, you have to be very concerned about position. I think more so than earlier in the draft, you have to be concerned about what position you draft as the draft goes on.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I would say that if you end up going with double running back right off the rip in the end of the first round, your first two picks are double running back. Like I think that you almost have to skip out on either an elite tight end or elite quarterback because there's, like you said, there once you get because you're talking about then like the 7, 12, 8, 1 range, it comes down to like Jordan Addison and JSN, Brian Thomas, uh, Hollywood Brown, who I don't mind, but like those are the players that you're looking at once you get to the 7, 12, and 8, 1. So
And
it's
those are
like,
starters for you.
yes. So you have to, I think, skip out on one of those positions and then just attack like the wide receiver position. Because I will say, like, if I start off with, say, Jahmyr Gibbs, Jonathan Taylor, you could get like Cooper Kupp, Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith back to back in the third, fourth rounds, which is really good. And then fifth round, you might be able to get like, I like Jaden Reed personally. Sometimes, Keenan Allen's there, Terry McLaurin, somebody, like that. But you, like you said, and like I already said, you just got to skip out on one of those positions. So
Right.
if you really like to go with the tight end early in quarterback, you can't go double running back, even though you may be tempted to.
Yeah, it's tough. And you never know, like, because we've talked about the ambiguity, I would say, of a lot of these drafts, right? Like, I know Tyler and I both have communities where we mock draft. And if you want to mock draft with us, make sure to drop us a follow and sub to our pages so you can get involved with the drafts. But I know our communities draft differently, right? Like some of the
Yeah.
guys you mentioned would not be there in the back end of the third round. And like a Cooper Kupp to me in my drafts might go a little bit earlier. So make sure you mock draft a lot. Make sure you have a chance to go through each of these positions and find what strategy works best for you and find the players that you like. So say you do have an affinity for, like, you like Nico Collins at the back end of the third round, and you do like, you would be happy with Nico Collins and Cooper Kupp stack, but maybe in a different draft they don't go there. Like, you have to know who you're drafting with and what your rules are as well, so that you can identify which of these positions you like the best. For me, I think I can find value at any one of these, Tyler, and I feel like, one of the things I'm learning as we're going through these mocks is that because these drafts are so different, you have to have players in tiers. You can't go straight by ADP. You cannot go straight by rankings. And all of these, every fantasy player this year that's going to be playing is going to have their own valuation of how things should go.
Yeah, and kind of what you said, like you got to do multiple drafts because we have different communities, they draft differently. Where I've seen, and this is the biggest problem with once you have this late first round pick, once you get into these middle rounds, because you can have like there's times where I've seen Nico Collins go mid second, but then there's also times that I see him go late third, and it's the same with like Michael Pittman and other players like this, where once you get to the second round, you just see all these guys really like the top like 15 picks, 14 picks are pretty secure. And then once you get past that, like these guys move around a lot in the third and fourth rounds. So you got to really decide who you like. What you said, draft in tiers, make sure you're tiering guys, know who's going to be at the beginning of the tier when you're on the board and who's going to be at the end of the tier. So, like maybe your next pick. So, well, I don't really like who's at the bottom. Well, you got to go that position right now because you're just not going to like who's on the board. And you're a lot of times when you start to like skip out on positions and then you start to draft players that you really like that are still available, you just end up really thin at a position. So you got to know the best thing to do is just draft by the tiers. And like you said, mock, like it's like a test, mock as much as you can. I can't believe that some people don't even mock and they just show up to their draft. I mean, it's crazy. And sometimes it works out. Everything can work out like that. But like, it's just nice to know, like off the top of my head, I can tell you where certain players are going in sleeper drafts. You just get that knowledge built up in your mind and you're just able to already visualize the tiers in your head. So mock as much as you can.
Mock as much as you can, my man. I would say if I had to rate these spots, I would say my favorite is probably, this is obviously very minuscule. My favorite's probably the 104. And then my least favorite's probably like the 111, I would say, if I had to just rank them. Like, I think the 4 value, I'm still getting an elite player. I feel like I can find value as the second round comes to an end. And I feel like later on you get your guys anyway. So I would say the 104 is probably my favorite. And then the 111, I'm not really a big fan of it because I feel like you're kind of forced to take the best of the worst of the best. And then I also feel like you have to kind of reach around that player that's at the turn too. So that's how I got it. Hey, what's your worst and best?
Worst is definitely like I said, the 109. I don't like the 109. I don't like who you got to take there. And a lot of times it doesn't work out in the second round. Who you want to just fall doesn't happen. So 109. And really the best, it's hard to say. I'm going to cop out. Like any pick in the top 5, really, I think it's just great. Like I think it's the best start.
Best, bro. You gotta pick a best.
All right, the best. I'll go with 5 because I love Brees Hall, I love Jamar Chase, and typically they're there at the 5. So I like that.
Good shit. Well, appreciate you guys tuning in. Hopefully you found some value in this conversation about top draft picks. We get a lot of questions about it. Obviously, all are great. You're playing fantasy football. You're going to be having fun and have an opportunity to win. So anything else you got, Tyler, as far as like draft picks or anything that goes around that conversation?
No, I mean, the great Matthew Berry, one of the best quotes in fantasy. You can't win your fantasy football draft, but you can lose it. And you can do that. So just make sure that during the season, the draft is just part of the puzzle, right?
Yes.
During the season, you got to manage the team. So you can look at your team and say you drafted well, and stuff falls apart. So you got to make sure that you're managing your team throughout the season. It's just the beginning. So don't overreact if you don't like your team or you love your team. Just know it's a long, long season where you got to manage your team.
In-season management trumps the draft every single time.
That's the true part of when fantasy starts, is when stuff goes wrong. You got to be able to be a firefighter and put out the fires and manage the team.
Adaption above all. Well, appreciate you guys tuning in. We'll see you guys on the next one. Peace out.
Peace.